Yeah, so I know you've done ayahuasca in South America, and we've done mushrooms together before.
Yep.
So what was different about this time to be effective for you versus before?
Well, the intentionality and the structure. So it's really interesting because I've done mushrooms in a group setting that was more like a party or a gathering, and I've done them where it feels very focused. And do you want to pause? You got a little
And the interloper, you
tiny
guys
invader.
can hear that. Yeah, that's
Yeah.
that's my daughter.
Aw, so cute. Um, so yeah, the container, right? The context is decisive. And so having the clear intentionality to do what I did shifted a lot inside of me. Yeah, I'm not sure what to say beyond that. Having done mushrooms before, having done them with you and other people, I wasn't doing a much more significant dose than I had done those times, but the container was set slightly differently. And um, so I did series of meditations and journaling and intention setting and writing before I took anything.
And then during the experience, were you like following some steps that you had set for yourself?
Well, so internal family systems therapy is basically a parts integration modality where it's similar to family dynamics counseling or family counseling, but looking at the different parts of ourselves as different characters that might not be getting along very well. And so the idea is to ask the other parts to leave you alone with the part that seems to be the the one we don't like, for lack of a better term, right? So imagine you're at a party, everyone is behaving nicely, everything is going to plan, and that feels like a victory. And then some loud, dirty, drunk storms through the door screaming, and everyone gets mad all of a sudden. All these nice people are like, everything would be great if you weren't here. And so that's how it was internally, right? If only these parts of me would just shut up and leave me alone, then everything would be okay. And so what this process does is it has you ask those suddenly judgy uh, parts of oneself to leave you alone with the offender. And you say, look, I'm not going to give them any more power. I'm just going to talk to them. And all of a sudden the judgment melts away. And you have a conversation with this part of yourself where you are trying to see the goodness inside of it, right? And then once you see the goodness, you want to look at what is its burden? What does it think it has to do? Because it's essentially like some dirty drunk storms in and it thinks that there's a bomb at the venue where this party was happening. And if it doesn't go and diffuse this thing, then everyone's going to die, right? It's like this intensity. And so what you do is you basically relieve it of its burden, right? Yeah, there's another metaphor that helped. I knew someone who every time they got mad, every time she got mad, she would say, my inner teenager's coming out. And after enough times of that, I said, well, can you tell me how you were as a teenager? She said, oh yeah, I shaved my head and I wore steel toe boots and I would go and hitchhike and not tell my parents. And I would show up in other countries and say, okay, got it. And then I said, how were you as a kid? Did you feel infringed upon and in danger as a child? And she was like, yeah, quite often. So, oh, okay. So is it possible that that teenager developed as a protector for the inner child? And that really what's happening was the inner child inside of this person was feeling threatened. She's like, oh yeah. So I started picturing that, right? If a teenager was trying to protect a small child and a bunch of well-meaning adults were trying to take the child from it, the teenager would get angrier and louder. And what it would need was someone to back off the well-meaning but horde and say, hey, thank you for protecting this child. I've got it now. I'm here. I'm an adult. I can take care of this. You don't have to be responsible. You don't have to go even, right? You can make sure I'm doing it right, but I got this. And all of a sudden the relief that that teenager would have of having a responsible, caring adult is how I pictured it.
Mm-hmm.
And so I did that internally. I made a list of every part of myself that I wished would just piss off, and went through this journey of embracing it and clearing it and relieving those parts of the burden and allowing another part that felt more appropriate to where I'm heading to take over that job. And I felt a massive internal shift.
Wow, that's I like your expression of, you know, seeing the plexiglass cage and having the door open, and then I mean there's still the task of, as what we were talking about in the very beginning. There's still, you can, some people, the door is open and they don't walk through it because it's still more comfortable just to stay in the box, you know, stay in the
Yeah.
cage.
Well, people talk about like it's a phenomenon. Some people, when they leave prison, actually feel more comfortable in prison. It's like at the end of Castaway, where the Tom Hanks character can't sleep on the bed because it's so uncomfortable. He wants to sleep on the floor in the hotel room.
That's real. I interviewed these people that spent a year in the wilderness, and
Yeah.
when they got home, they would like freak them out. They were like, they would sleep on the floor, or they would just like go sleep in their backyard. They were like, it's just too weird to sleep in a bed.
Hmm.
Took them like 6 weeks to learn to sleep in a bed.
Yeah. Even the beds from Indonesia, where I was, and my place in Bali, to here, like these beds are so soft, it's driving me nuts. I keep feeling like I'm going to roll off the side of them. But the fun thing was realizing that I didn't actually have access to certain functional patterns inside of the states that I was in because of the trauma. And for years, I was beating myself up, trying to work harder, and not getting very far. And realizing that what was missing was a sense of safety, security to move forward. That Joe Dispenza talks about it in the Breaking the Habit of Being Yourself, in that book, in the form of brain frequencies. And depending on which brain frequency you're in, you only have access to certain functionalities. And there's something that I'm recently exploring, which is something called polyvagal theory. And what they talk about there is more of a nervous system version of that. Where you are in your nervous system dictates how you get to behave. And so what trauma does is it's the stuck state that the fear from the past is still present. It's this feeling of being in some version of fight or flight or freeze constantly. And so what happened was, after I recovered enough physically from my head injury, the emotional stuff felt shifted from that trauma release, and last little bits had to come up. And it was almost like a test where I saw I wasn't thrown the same way that I used to be. Some things happened. Some people did things that used to upset me. And at first I reacted in a big way. And then I realized a lot of that was fear of going back into the same
Mm.
loops. And when that didn't happen, I was able to respond from a much more adult and secure place. And that's when Bali felt complete.
And what I've come to realize is that um, trauma, you know, any degree of trauma may be controlling your physiology, and you have a physiological response to something, and then your rational mind explains it. So you know, you might be in an argument with someone, they react a certain way, and they're like, it's because you did XYZ, and
Right.
that's not actually it. It's this like physiological response, and then the rationalization just comes because they're just trying to make sense of it, but it probably not that thing.
It's often not, but it can be important to look at what are the things that are triggering. And even that word, well, most people have no idea what triggering means, or just have a skewed sense of it. Being mildly upset or dissatisfied with a thing isn't triggered. Triggered is being thrown back into an old fixed state of terror, essentially, that the pain from the past is present again. And so when people are actually triggered, they're no longer fully present. They're no longer here in their entirety. They're back whenever the trauma happened. And that can be really difficult, especially when the trauma is not a conscious thing. Some people don't have actual memory of what traumatized them. In some cases, and this can be really dangerous, is that because it might not be on paper as horrific as some things that we've heard of, or, I mean, I know people who've been through really, really awful things. And the things that traumatized me weren't anywhere near as bad if we're just going to make a list of bad things.
Yeah.
But because at the time I didn't have the ability to process them fully, they got stuck. Right. So when people say, oh, 2020 is traumatizing, it's a traumatizing year, it's like, maybe, but it's sort of how my head injury, a lot of people are like, oh, trauma, that must have been so traumatic. I don't feel like I have trauma around that, because I woke up and it felt energetically and emotionally complete. Though no part of me went into, oh, why did that happen to me? It was just, oh, that happened.
Yeah.
Gosh darn, I guess I just need to keep going now. Right.
Sure.
And so it felt like a very healthy, forward moving energy. All right. It wasn't ignoring it, but it was just, okay, that happened. Now what? And so bad things can happen and we might not be traumatized by them. And then seemingly small things can happen that get stuck. And it's
Yeah, and I
important
do think
because a lot of people dismiss their own pain.
yeah, I think it's important here. Like, there's, you know, maybe who calls it like big T, little T. There's like somebody abused you, like, oh, big trauma, like, or there's like you just like fell down and scraped your knee, you
Uh-huh.
know, and nobody picked you up. So there's like all these varying degrees, and I agree. It's this year, obviously, people are totally the whole range, like the interpretation of how good or bad this is just totally across the board, and there's all these different interpretations of trauma for each person or events, whether they're traumatic or not.
Mm-hmm. Like, so I've been sexually abused. I've been mentally, physically, emotionally abused. But the the sexual abuse, I was molested by this guy, this adult man, when I was a kid. But I had a moment where I knocked him over, even as a little kid, and then pushed some furniture that sort of trapped him for a while, and I regained a sense of strength. And with my ex stepfather, who used to like choke me up against the wall, I at one point realized that I got bigger than him and knocked him over. And he fell down on my little brother's Tonka truck or something. And he looked at me with these big scared eyes. And I just said, we're done now, right? And there was one time after that he did something physical. He grabbed me and took chunks of my skin out with his fingernails from the back of my neck.
Jeez.
But for the most part, a lot of my upset was not feeling like anyone was there to protect me. And when I tried to talk to people about it, that was blocked. And so it's interesting because, again, the big T, little T, I know people who've had cigarettes put out on them, who've been hit with wrenches and crowbars and like really, really awful things. People have been raped, and nothing that I've been through compares. And yet that's not the point, is that a lot of this isn't logical. and if we can't function because something's incomplete from the past and it just brings up pain, fear, then it needs to be dealt with. And until I named it, I was so afraid of being labeled that I wasn't looking at trauma. I didn't even want to label myself as someone who had trauma. And when I had to make this distinction between labeling and naming, just saying, oh, that's trauma. And when I did that and I started looking at it, books on complex PTSD felt like they were just written about me. It's like, wow, this is exactly what I've been going through. This is a thing. Oh, because it's a thing that people have studied, potentially there's pathways through it. And then I got through it pretty quickly, but I'd spent 40 years just rolling around in this stuff, thinking I was doing work.
Mm. Man, what I'm feeling right now is just like, I just can't believe. And here's the thing, like, first I'm just amazed when you say like people being hit with wrenches and stuff. Like, how is this even possible?
Well, I
That
mean, I can't even imagine, like, as a parent, right? Like, you're such a loving dad. I see you with your kids, right? I mean, I've been there for a big part of the process, to the point that you call me Uncle Nick with your kids, and I was there when you and your wife got pregnant with your first child, and
we were freaking out.
I was there through a lot of the pregnancy, but like, I look at my dad's eyes tear up, and I can imagine your eyes tearing up. The idea of a parent hurting their child, right? And then the pain of the child feeling that this is the person that's supposed to protect me,
And
and they're
just the other day, I told my daughter not to put her hand in her glass of milk, and she got so sad. And I was like, "Oh no, what have I done?" I'm like, I'm just doing my job. I'm trying to teach her to be polite, and it's like, oh God, could I traumatize her by telling her no?
yeah. And some of these things we have to understand are just normal, right? Like, disagreements are normal, right? Having certain forms of discipline are normal inside of that relationship, but that's not the same as abuse. And I think so much of the dialogue that seems to be happening out in the world, people don't understand the difference anymore.
Well, here's something I want to share. Something that I've been noticing in my parenting a lot. And would I do things with my kids that I wouldn't do with adults, like pick them up and put them in the bath? Like, I wouldn't do that to a friend, right?
Sure.
And there's a lot of, it's this fine line of like, I get to say what you do, this control. And as a child ages, they have more and more of their own sort of, actually, I don't want to do that, and then you have to negotiate.
Mm.
But it's reflecting, like, where am I just like blindly trying to control this other human being versus like taking into consideration. And one example that's coming up is, if they're watching cartoons and I'm like, it's time to go, and I just turn them off, they will flip their lid. They hate that, right? If you just change their scenario for them. But if you say like, okay, 10 seconds and we're going to turn it off, or 5 minutes and I'll come back, they're totally prepared for it and they can go along and there's no pushback. And it's just, how often in our lives are we trying to control other people? Are we trying to get them to do what we want them to do? And
A lot of people don't stop, right?
yeah,
So you mentioned something earlier that was along the lines of, I forget what you said exactly, but it stuck out with me. It was this idea that someone said something, therefore I'm upset, rather than the inner self. Like, I'm upset because I'm upset. Something happened, now I'm upset. That's how I'm reacting. And what most people seem to do is say, that person said something, now I'm upset. I'm going to now train them not to upset me anymore, right? Or I'm going to give them my love languages so they can love me properly and quit the bullshit that they've been doing, and and shift it, instead of saying, how can I listen to the way that they love and hear it as love, and train inwardly. Where the parental thing is interesting. Like, I'm not a parent, but my siblings are so much younger than me that I sort of play acted as a parent for a while. So there's a 13 and 15 years age difference between my brother and sister and
yeah.
me. So I'm much older. And I always saw it as my job to make them the strongest, shiniest versions of themselves as I could. And so sometimes that meant having them not stick their hands in their milk, or not watching TV all day. And yet it was with the design not to impose my will on them so they bent and kneeled before Zod, just to get really comic book nerdy about it. But to, yeah, uh, I can explain. People can just Google who Zod is.
Google it, look it up.
And yeah, my task was actually to help them be the strongest versions of themselves that they could be. And sometimes I was right and sometimes I wasn't. And I tried to talk them through that as much as possible, right, when it was appropriate. But yeah, there are elements there that I want to ask you about that sort of lead from where I'm at in my process. And I mean, you asked me about leaving Bali, but the thing was, it was a little bit like that cage opened, and then those release videos um, of animals being released back into the wild, where at first the cage might be open, but they're not sure if this is
Mhm.
another trap,
Yeah,
and they
yeah, yeah.
take a couple steps and smell the air, and then head out. There's been this sense of, well, now what? Doesn't mean that all of a sudden I'm operating at the level that I know I could operate on or that I aspire to operate on. And this is one of the things that I've always seen as one of your strengths is your ability to unhook from the past and reinvent yourself. Because you've had all these different experiences in your life where you've been a scientist or an athlete or a public speaker and podcaster or coach. And sometimes they overlap, sometimes they don't. But my fear of labeling myself anything has kept me away from, like, when I played ultimate frisbee in Korea, I had friends who I would say, oh, they're ultimate frisbee players, I'm just someone who plays ultimate frisbee. Like, I was trying to make this distinction, which kept me from training as hard or paying as much attention and doing it fully. Now that I feel more and more prepared to do things fully, I'm realizing there are certain skills I need to learn, even around learning how to do that. So I'd love if you could speak a little bit about how does one learn to take something on to a high level and start from a low level.
There's a few ways I could go with that, but I want to start with this story of actually one time in Bali. I was just driving on the motorcycle and realized I was like, I have no identity at this point. I had just lost a lot of former identity things, like I lost my marriage, lost my house, lost my career, a lot, and so all those formerly things that I would have said like I'm a this or that weren't there, and I was like, I'm just me. Like I don't have a label or an identity or anything. And it was very perplexing for a while to realize
Mm,
that. And then I was like, okay, well, I just don't have this identity. And then, I'm now that I'm back home and I have some physical stuff. This is really very interesting to me. Physical objects that remind you of high school or elementary school or a trip you took as a kid, or like my patch from space camp or something. You're like, that's who I was then, and I know what it was like to be that person then. So I'm reluctant to throw this object away to like clean my basement or like get rid
mm.
of stuff. So I'm holding this, like I have all these, I call them horcruxes, like part of my soul is like tied up in some like weird physical object. uh
That's the part of the series that I'm listening to right now, actually.
oh
Like,
really?
I'm really listening to the Harry Potter. I've never
Yeah.
listened to it before, and yeah,
So
that's
it's
starting to
just
come
it's
up.
just weird, but where I'm working from is, if I have no past, if I have no identity, well, first of all, we only have the present moment. But if I, can totally be free of any past identity, then I'm just who I am. And it makes it weird when you're like trying to market yourself or write a description on LinkedIn or something like, who am I? Because really you're just like making up a thing so people can be like, oh, I want to like hire this person or listen to their podcast or whatever. But yeah, I mean, identity is such a weird thing. Yeah, at this point I'm trying to not get tied up in any of the past identity things that I would have. And so an example of that is, I just happened to win the state cycling championships, and I hadn't won for since I was a junior. Like 20 years ago I won a state championship, and now I won the master state championship. But the difference is that how much it meant to me about my identity. Like back then it meant everything. It meant I was like worthy of love and popular and like strong. And what it meant this time was that I was able to deploy my very limited time and training resources while parenting and running a business and doing all these other things so that I could still win a state championship, but with like the very minimal effort. And I thought that was kind of cool. It was kind of an experiment, and I was like, "Oh, cool! That I can take some of these lessons and apply them to people I'm training." So it didn't necessarily like make me feel like a state champion, although I'm pleased to do well in something that I set an intention for. But just noticing how the same thing 20 years apart would make such a big difference to my identity or ego versus not at all.